Welcome back to my series, Green Cards for Me, but Not for Thee, where I expose the loudest anti-immigrant voices. Today's star? Senator Marco Rubio. Marco is the third child of Mario and Oria Rubio. They grew up poor in Cuba and moved to Miami in 1956, looking for work and a better life. Not fleeing Castro, not escaping communism, just regular immigrants seeking a better life for themselves and their future family. But here's where it gets shady. Rubio spent years campaigning on the idea that his parents were fleeing communism. They were exiles. Except Castro didn't even take power until 1959, 3 years after his parents moved to Miami. He later tried to backtrack and revise the story after he was exposed, but not before building his entire brand on that myth. He represents the state with the fourth largest immigrant population in the entire country. He sells himself as the embodiment of the American dream, and yet he shows almost zero sympathy for immigrants whose stories look exactly like his own family's. And it gets even better because his parents weren't even US citizens when he was born. He became a citizen through birthright citizenship, which his party now wants to take away from others. Marco, baby, why don't you just tell us what this is really about? Because we know it's not about coming the right way. Go on, say it out loud. Welcome to part 2 of Marco Rubio's immigration saga, because one video wasn't enough to cover all of the irony. In part 1, we talked about how his parents immigrated from Cuba, not because of political persecution, but just regular migration. But that didn't stop him from using that story to rise through the ranks as the face of the American dream, all the while being ever so loyal to Donnie T, like a good little niño. And his loyalty was rewarded, because in January of this year, anti-immigrant, child of Cuban immigrants himself, Marco Rubio, got promoted and was named Secretary of State, a title that now lets him lead one of the most aggressive anti-immigration crackdowns that we've ever seen. Oh, and don't let the job title fool you. This man is now personally signing off on student visa cancellations, halting new interviews, and launching AI-powered social media surveillance to revoke status. Marco Rubio is living proof that you can be the child of immigrants and still grow up to become the exact kind of official that your parents would have been terrified of. Let's dive deeper into the real family dirt, because what I didn't share with you is that Marquito's very own grandfather was ordered deported from the United States at one point. Marco's abuelo, Pedro Victor Garcia, initially came to the United States from Cuba in 1956. After a short time in the United States, he returned to Cuba. And after 2 years in his native Cuba, he attempted to return to Miami. And upon his arrival, he had to appear at an immigration hearing because his original green card was no longer valid. And at this hearing, he was ordered to be deported. Here's an actual clip from that hearing. But despite this order, Garcia continued to live in the United States under parole status. Then, in 1966, the Cuban Adjustment Act passed, which changed the game for Cuban immigrants. And it finally allowed Garcia here to apply for permanent residency. So thanks to favorable immigration laws, Marco Rubio's grandfather was allowed to stay in the United States permanently. And despite all of that, we still have this guy, one of the loudest critics of immigration, sitting on the very policies that helped his family remain in the United States. But he is now working so hard to close that door behind him, blocking future generations of immigrants from doing exactly what his own family did. But what I haven't told you is that his cuñado, his brother-in-law, was one of Miami's most prolific cocaine drug traffickers. His name, Orlando Cecilia. He was convicted in the late 1980s as part of a massive drug ring, moving thousands of pounds of cocaine across South Florida. He was sentenced to 35 years for drug trafficking and money laundering. And the kicker? At the time of his arrest, Cecilia was living in the same house as Marco Rubio. That's right, the DEA kicked down Marco's front door. Cecilia ended up serving just 12 years and was released in 2000. But in 2002, just 2 years after his release, Marco Rubio, who was already climbing Florida's political ladder, personally submitted a letter recommending him for a real estate license. What Rubio didn't mention in that letter? That the applicant was his brother-in-law. And under normal circumstances, Cecilia's felony trafficking conviction would have been an automatic disqualifier. But as is often the case with these guys, it gets even wilder. Because fast forward to now, where Marco is the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, he's using his power to deport immigrants for old drug offenses. The very thing his brother-in-law was convicted of. Here's an actual quote from Rubio from just a couple of months ago. Imposing visa restrictions on drug traffickers, their family members, and close personal and business associates will not only prevent them from entering the United States, but it will also serve as a deterrent for continued illicit activities. Marquito, are you calling for your own brother-in-law's deportation? Because by your own logic, Orlando's out. And with your anchor baby status and close criminal family ties, you might want to go pack a bag too. Let me make one thing crystal clear. You cannot pay me to care about how Marco Rubio's family came to be in the United States. I do not care that he has a Cuban immigrant brother-in-law that was convicted of a felony drug charge 25 years ago. I'm not digging up family history for gossip's sake. Because let's be real, if Marquito wasn't out here attacking immigrants whose stories look a whole lot like his very own family's, none of this would be worth mentioning. But he is, and targeting people for far less than what his very own brother-in-law was convicted of. And here are just 2 examples of that. First up, Juan Erles Gonzalez, a 56-year-old Cuban who arrived in the United States in 1995. On June 13th of this year, he went to his regular ICE check-in in Miramar, Florida, something he's been doing every single year without issue. He was detained and is awaiting deportation. Back in 2007, he lost his permanent resident status after being convicted of a small cocaine conspiracy charge, and he served 18 months for his crime. Far less serious than the massive kilo trafficking case that Marco Rubio's brother-in-law, Orlando Cecilia, was convicted of. He served his time, and for the last 19 years, he's been a hardworking, contributing member of society. And then there's Isidro Perez, whose story is even more tragic. A 75-year-old Cuban immigrant who had been living in the United States for decades. In the 1980s, he was convicted of a marijuana possession and served 18 months in prison. Again, a far smaller offense than Orlando Cecilia's multi-kilo trafficking charge. Earlier this year, ICE agents picked him up at a community center in Miami. And instead of going home, he died in their custody. This is exactly the kind of hardline immigration policy that Marco Rubio is pushing, ruining lives over decades-old drug charges that are nothing compared to what his very own brother-in-law was convicted of. And if you think that calling out a politician on their hypocrisy is having a hard-on for them, then you might be part of the problem.